Honored guests, colleagues, and participants, let us honor the Philippine National Anthem.
Bayang magiliw, peros ng silanganan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y bungay. Lupang hinirang, buyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, kita masisingil, sa lagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mo bangag, may ilang ang tula at awit sa paglayang nilaman. Ang kisap ng watawat mo'y nagumpay na nagiging, ang bituin at harap niya kailan mapalik magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng maraming pagsita, kulay langit sa likod. Aming ligaya naman may mamagin, at lahat ay nanggaling sa'yo.
Okay. Honorable members of the University of the Philippines, distinguished guests, esteemed partners, fellow migration and environment practitioners and advocates, and our dear conference participants. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. I am Maria Angelica Abad, the Assistant Vice President for Public Affairs and the Director for the Office of Alumni Relations in the University of the Philippines System, as well as a proud faculty member of the University of the Philippines Diliman Extension Program in Pampanga. I will be your host for today. Today, we are joined together to witness the closing ceremony and the declaration of unity of the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action. This conference provided us with a venue for discourse and exploration on how our leaders, communities, and agencies could respond to the complex challenges of human mobility, climate change nexus, and explore possible ways forward. Over 3 days, the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action tackled the urgent need to address human mobility amid the climate crisis and its relation to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and to the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. The International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action would not have been possible without the following partners: the University of the Philippines, the premier state university in the country, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, or UNITAR, and the Department of Foreign Affairs, or DFA, in the Philippines, in partnership with CIFAL Global Network, CIFAL Shanghai, CIFAL Jeju, CIFAL Newcastle, International Organization for Migration, or IOM, in the Philippines, Center for Neighborhood Studies, or CENS, University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, or UPRI, and special thanks to Australian Embassy in the Philippines. With our media partners, Business World, ANC, the ABS-CBN News Channel, DZMM Teleradio, and CNN Philippines. To open our ceremony, let us call the ever-supportive partner of UP-CIFAL Philippines, none other than the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, in the Philippines, Ms. Christine Dady.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Well, I would first just like to start off by thanking CIFAL, the organizer, for this extremely timely international conference on human mobility and climate action. It's perfect timing ahead of COP26 next week, the climate change conference in Glasgow. So rather than running through all the partners, as our lovely host just did, I just want to acknowledge CIFAL for the tremendous effort in organizing this. I remember 2 years ago when IOM presented Professor Edna Coe with the Migrant Champion Award at the International Migrants Day at DFA. It was really the last time we had a public event before COVID. It was December 2019. And we specifically discussed how the climate crisis and how was before us, and how we needed to be putting migration at the forefront of the discussion and really mainstreaming it through the discussion. And wow, I mean, here we are 2 years later, a 3-day international conference talking about the nexus between human mobility and climate. I really am impressed and congratulate CIFAL for putting words into action. I humbly suggest we make this virtual conference an annual event, maybe before each COP, and let's keep it virtual because I know we all want to keep things green and sustainable. It would be great to look in a year where we're at and the recommendations and how we're doing, measuring it against our specific recommendations of the last few days. Again, the CIFAL team has just done a tremendous job of raising awareness of the issues, and I know how much work it takes to putting together an international conference. We're very proud partners of CIFAL. it's really this conference has offered a unique opportunity to champion a whole of society approach to tackle the climate crisis. I personally attended the opening, the plenary sessions, and many of the panel discussions, and I was absolutely encouraged by the high level of engagement. We witnessed how experts from academia, civil society, local governments in particular, in this country and abroad, sharing best practices and implementing mitigation and adaptation measures to protect the welfare of the most vulnerable. Undoubtedly, this conference has shown us that the climate crisis is a game changer in the landscape of human mobility. We heard very compelling data the last few days on how climate change is impacting human mobility, from migration to displacement to permanent relocation. And living here in the Philippines, we feel it more than most other countries. Last year alone, we heard that in the conference, we heard that 4.5 million people were displaced from climate-induced typhoons. 64% of the population lives along the coastal lines and will be greatly impacted not only by storms and flooding, but also by the sea level rise that is coming with the 2-degree expected rise in temperature. I was recently in Catanduanes a few months ago, and the governor there told me how they are sitting in the Pacific on the front line of climate change with 3 super typhoons alone last year. They're usually getting one every few years, and now they're getting them every year and multiple times. He noted specifically how the resilience of the people is really just no longer there. So this conference has underlined the urgent need to take action and to come up with longer term solutions. And we've heard really great recommendations over the last few days. I love that this conference was action oriented. It offered really a unique opportunity for all of us to share thoughts and ideas. As we close this conference, I just want to leave you with 3 takeaways. One, we should not walk away in despair. While the data we hear is very frightening, and believe me, as the mother of 4 teenage daughters, it keeps me up at night at times, but we do have solutions. And we've learned that migration can be part of that solution. We heard from Secretary Locsin in the opening that humans have been migrating for centuries, and sometimes as a coping mechanism to deal with the shocks that humans face. And we should continue to look at migration as a solution, adaptive migration that is safe, informed, and desired. The second point is that, the COVID crisis was a lesson learned and really gave us an opportunity to change the way that we behave when it comes to the climate crisis. COVID showed us what we are capable of accomplishing in a very short period when we have a crisis that affects each and every one of us. Vaccines were developed in record speed. And like COVID, the climate crisis is something that affects and impacts each and every one of us. So we need to come up with solutions together. But it brings me to my third point, which is just like COVID, we know that vulnerable populations feel the impact of the crisis the worst. We heard data the last few days about how impacted vulnerable populations are and how the climate crisis is driving inequity even more. So therefore, we have to put the protection of vulnerable populations at the forefront of everything we do in terms of addressing the climate crisis. So as we close this conference, let's not forget that we have solutions, that we must work together, and above all, we must protect the most vulnerable of our society. As Secretary Antonio Guterres said, the climate emergency is a race we are losing, but it is a race we can win together. So I thank you very much for this very timely conference, and I look forward to continued work together in the future to address something that we all care so passionately about. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Deidi, and we look forward to a continuing meaningful partnership with IOM Philippines. So gracing us with a powerful and meaningful performance, we would like to call on mga anak ni Inang Daigdig, or the children of Mother Earth, a professional Philippine dance company that showcases a rich and varied cross-section of the country's culture and traditions through music and dance. Please welcome mga anak ni Inang Daigdig, or the children of Mother Earth.
Tinabas ang mga kahoy sa kagubatan, halos malipol ng lahat ang tamaraw at agila. Sa dinamit at muro ami, istay ubos sa karagatan. Bahagi na lamang ng koral ang ngayoy natitira. Ilog at isteroy, sakal na ng sapal at krudo. Pasurang gabundok, umaalingasaw sa kalunsuran. Buga ng pabrika'y
Thank you so much, mga anak ni Inang Daigdig, for such a compelling performance. Let us give them a virtual round of applause, please. Please use your reaction buttons and show your appreciation to mga anak ni Inang Daigdig. Okay, so now we learned from this conference that this planet is not ours alone and will not be in the future. And so it is important for us to pass the torch to our future leaders, our next generation, the heir to our planet, our youth. It is high time to recognize the vital role of our young people and the role that they play in ensuring the protection of the rights of our climate migrants amid the ongoing climate crisis. Raising the voices of the youth, it is my honor to call on the convener and international spokesperson of the Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, or YACAP, Mitzi Janelle Tan.
Hi everyone, I'm Mitzi Jonelle Tan from Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines. And in the past few days, we've learned quite a lot about human mobility and climate action, and how these two seemingly very separate and different topics actually have a very complex relationship. But really what we have to remember is that the climate crisis, it's not just an environmental issue, it's not just a scientific issue, it is a systemic problem that at its core is impacting humans, and so it's so connected to human mobility. Coming from a country coming from the Philippines, a country that has the second highest internal displacement because of extreme weather events, it's so important to remember that the impacts of the climate crisis are already here, and this migration is already happening. And it's not something that we should use as a threat to global north countries. I say this in the sense that sometimes we might not even be aware of it, but there are times when the rising number of climate migrants, or the threat of the rising numbers of climate migrants, is used as kind of the reason why global north countries should drastically cut carbon dioxide emissions and have urgent climate actions and plans. So as an example, sometimes I would see statements that are like, we have to drastically cut carbon dioxide emissions and have urgent climate action because there will be more climate refugees and there will be more climate migrants, and they'll have to enter into global north countries. And so what that does is that it demonizes the refugees and the migrants as if they're the threat here. It removes the accountability and the responsibility from the global north countries that have caused the climate crisis. And it also demonizes other migrants and refugees that are doing it for other reasons, such as political reasons or economic reasons or even cultural reasons. Really, why are we in a world that separates each other from each other so much? When did we cross into a world that thinks that cultural exchange and the free flow of movement is something that is wrong? And that's something that we have to really look at. We have to make sure that we have, adaptive climate migration, and we have to reduce the inequality between countries and really make sure that there is a safe and orderly and regular and responsible migration flow from countries that really need it, such as the Pacific Island nations. And again, it's not just about climate refugees, it's about refugees and migrants in general. You can see how it's all really tied together. For example, a friend from Guatemala told me how, years ago, the U.S. Wanted to ensure the imports of bananas from Guatemala to the U.S. So the banana plantations and the monoculture plantations that are destroying the environment, in a way, caused the political instability that they're experiencing now, which is causing political refugees. And so it's really how all of these come together and play with each other, and they're not separated from each other at all, because again, the climate crisis is only a symptom of the broken and unjust system that we have. It's not separated from all the other migration cases. And really, with everything happening in this world and with the very concrete scientific based facts of the climate crisis, it's so wild to me that we still have not recognized the international rights of climate refugees, in the sense that it's not even an international term, that there is no refugee rights for people who have to migrate because of climate impacts. And that's something that we really have to focus on and demand for. And another thing is that we have to realize that while we call for drastic carbon dioxide emission cuts and leaving the fossil fuel industry and making sure that the climate crisis doesn't get worse than it already is, we have to realize and accept that the existing impacts of the climate crisis that are already happening to countries like the Philippines, these are irreversible and they will happen and they are happening. And so we need to be able to adapt. And to do that, we need reparations from the global north. And we need reparations for all the loss and damages that we've already experienced in our countries. And these reparations and these adaptation plans, some of these might mean we'll have to migrate, because that is the reality of the climate crisis today. And so we have to be proactive and make sure that we really build more resilient cities and build more resilient countries, but also start changing our concept of migration and start changing the rules and the laws that keep people out, keep the most marginalized people out. And that's always the thing, like with the refugee crisis, with the climate crisis, it's always the people who are most marginalized and also the least responsible who are left behind and forgotten every single time. And that is something that we have to really ensure when we talk about climate justice. It's not about the environment. It's not just about the environment. It's not just about the extreme weather events. It's about how the people most impacted aren't able to adapt, aren't able to bounce back, how the loss and damages that we've experienced, all the cultures, all the biodiversity, all the people and families and homes that we've lost, these are things that are gone and they need to be talked about more, and there needs to be reparations and climate finance for loss and damages and for adaptation measures and for carbon dioxide emission cuts and to ensure the human mobility and the free flow of movement of people across the globe. And I think something that we should all really take away from this is that there are so many different ways to really ensure the living quality, the improvement of the quality of living of people. And we have to take every single one of it. We have to remember that the climate crisis is already here. And if we don't do anything, it will get worse. So we have to make sure it doesn't get worse. But again, the impacts that are already here, we have to make sure that people most marginalized aren't left behind. And something that my friends like to remind people also, like my other friends from the Global South, it's not about one single country. Something that I learned of being in a global youth movement is that the climate crisis is a global problem, and we are only going to be able to solve it if we come together as one community, if we unite and we show solidarity and we fight alongside the most marginalized communities. That is the way that we achieve climate justice. And with key negotiations such as COP26 coming up in a month, I think, it's so important that we talk about these key issues, because otherwise it will be left behind and it will be forgotten once again. And that's not what we need, and that's not what we are calling for. And all of this information might seem so overwhelming and might feel so out of this world almost, like, how are we going to even begin to address the climate crisis and the refugee crisis and human mobility and ensuring the rights of people? But I want everyone to remember that empires have fallen in the past, that the youth especially are such a revolutionary generation. If you look at history In almost every historical moment, the youth have been there fighting alongside the most marginalized sectors of society. And if the youth and the most marginalized really come together and unite, then that is such a powerful thing. And remember that it isn't just a struggle in one country. We are all fighting for climate justice together because our liberations are tied together. And so that is such a beautiful thing to me when I remember that I'm not alone in this and you're not alone in this. And so you just have to remember that we can change the world and we have to. And that will happen if we all unite and if we all remember that we're fighting for a system and a society that focuses on community and helping each other and making sure that the most marginalized aren't left behind and led by the most marginalized even. And not one that's based on everlasting growth that doesn't even exist, that isn't even possible, and isn't based on the profit of the global north and the overexploitation of the global south. That is what we have to remember, that we have to fight for a world that leaves no one behind.
So thank you very much, Mitzi, for such a powerfully impassioned and heartfelt call to action. The voice of the youth gives us hope for a better and kinder world for future generations. So yesterday, we had a collaboration through our virtual World Cafe, wherein we shared our insights on existing gaps, entry points, and possible areas for collective action in addressing the issues surrounding the migration, environment, and climate change nexus. We discussed and debated on topics like disaster risk reduction and resilience, safe and dignified settlement and planned relocation, sustainable urban development for smart and livable cities, upskilling environmental migrants, social protection for migrants, and emergency response, among others. Through the help of our World Cafe moderators, we have synthesized and harmonized our key points into a declaration of unity for policy roadmap. To deliver our declaration of unity, let us call on the director of the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, or UPRI. Colleagues, partners, and participants, please welcome Dr. Mahar Lagmay.
Hello, can you hear me? Ma'am Abad, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly and we can see you. You look great and you sound great. Go ahead, Mahar.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite everybody to join me in the Declaration of Unity for this International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action. Okay? Okay. We, the organizers, participants, partners, and advocates of human mobility and climate action, call for an urgent response to the complex challenges of migration, environment, and climate change nexus. For the people, we champion for improved education, awareness, raising, and human and institutional capacity building through social and behavior change communication in relation to migration and climate change. We rally behind children, women, LGBTQIA+, indigenous people, older persons, and irregular migrants as they center the narratives for interdisciplinary approaches for social protection measures. For the planet, we call for sustainable urban planning and governance for the development of smart and livable cities and communities maximizing sustainable transportation systems, proper waste management, and infrastructure development, among others. We advocate for community-based, inclusive, participatory, and evidence-based strategies for disaster risk reduction and resilience. For peace, we work for the protection of human rights and welfare in relocation and resettlement planning and implementation, including the provision of basic social services, access to justice, elimination of discrimination, and promotion of healthy, narrative on the experiences of climate migrants and displaced populations. For prosperity, we advocate for inclusive blue and green economies while upskilling environmental migrants towards climate resilience and sustainable development through skills enhancement, competencies, employability, and entrepreneurship. We demand transparent resource allocation, funding, and investment mechanisms for disaster risk reduction and resilience while fostering interagency, intergovernment, and public-private collaboration. For partnership, we call for a multi-stakeholder cooperation involving national and local governments, non-government organizations, civil society organizations, academe, international organizations, the private sector, and the general public towards responsive migration governance amid the climate crisis. We advocate for interstate and inter-regional cooperation to pave regular pathways for and to ensure safe, orderly, and dignified return and reintegration of climate migrants. We champion for a whole of society approach in adaptation, mitigation, and resilience building as the response to the climate crisis. We call for a comprehensive, holistic, and inclusive green migration governance that recognizes migration as a last resort and that in the event of migration, we ensure the dignity, safety, and human rights of climate migrants. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lagmay, for delivering such a powerful call for unity, which has been the result of collaboration among our international conference participants. To signify the support for the call of our participants, this declaration of unity will be signed by our conference partners. Okay, so beyond and after this conference, we urge you to continue to actively participate in the calls for ensuring safe, orderly, and regular movement for climate migrants while addressing the ongoing climate crisis. The International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action would not have been possible without the following partners: the University of the Philippines, the premier state university in the country, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, or UNITAR, and the Department of Foreign Affairs, or DFA, in the Philippines, in partnership with CIFAL Global Network, CIFAL Shanghai, CIFAL Jeju, CIFAL Newcastle, International Organization for Migration, or IOM, in the Philippines, Center for Neighborhood Studies, or CENS, University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, or UPRI, and special thanks to Australian Embassy in the Philippines. With our media partners, Business World, ANC, the ABS-CBN News Channel, DZMM, Teleradio, and CNN Philippines. On behalf of UPCFAL Philippines, thank you to our participants for actively participating and responding to the urgent call to address the issues surrounding human mobility and climate change nexus. This formally concludes the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action, a very timely and relevant discussion as we witness a continuous increase in human mobility amid the ongoing crisis. Thank you and have a great day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great job, CIFAL.
In 2016, the International Training Center for Authorities and Leaders Philippines, or UPCPhal Philippines, was launched by the University of the Philippines in partnership with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, or UNITAR. UPCPhal Philippines is one of the first few university-based CPhal centers affiliated with the UNITAR. Today, the UPCPhal Philippines continues to grow with UNITAR as the global network grows to 22 CPhal centers in Asia, Australia, Africa, Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean. UPCPhal Philippines joins UNITAR in pursuit of promoting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development through capacity building and research, two functions which are centrally located in the academy. The University of the Philippines is the only national university of the country, which makes UPCPhal Philippines distinctly located to make its contributions as a CPhal center reach to as many sectors as possible. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged the academe in ensuring quality education for all. As a response, UPCPhal Philippines swiftly conducted webinars to serve as discourse on key issues of the pandemic on health and well-being, education, crisis management, migration, women and youth, food and water security, and the environment. In mainstreaming the SDGs through education amid the pandemic, the UPCPhal Philippines collaborated with the Philippine Commission on Higher Education in reaching more than 200 educators from 110 state universities and colleges and private higher education institutions on integrating the SDGs into curricular programs. The UPCPhal Philippines shared concrete examples of offering elective courses on the SDGs, highlighting the value of applying the concepts of sustainable development into practical projects and learning. Online discussions such as this could not be done without key partnerships with fellow academe, United Nations agencies, government agencies, civil society organizations, and the private sector. Such collaborations demonstrate the strength of the university-anchored SDG promoter in bringing in different actors into a coalition on how to move forward and beyond the pandemic. Reaching over 6,000 learners who come from across the Philippine nation and over 53 countries, UPCPhal Philippines continues to build knowledge on ways in accomplishing the sustainable development amid the pandemic. The UPCPhal Philippines takes such knowledge building into another level through its offering of 2 online continuing education programs for professionals: the professional course on global migration and the professional course on digital governance and cybersecurity. The professional course on global migration, or PCGM, promotes decent work and equality through comprehensive and pragmatic approaches to addressing the challenges of migration governance. The PCGM partnered with United Nations agencies, the UNITAR, and the International Organization for Migration to highlight the diverse impacts of human mobility and its cross-border links to sustainable development. Who are the migrants and how do we stand up for their rights? How can practitioners place themselves in their shoes to better understand and empower migrants and their families throughout their journey? The PCGM relays the many dimensions of global migration to help professionals develop holistic and grounded migration governance plans, programs, and policies. The Professional Course on Digital Governance and Cybersecurity, or PCDGC, promotes strong institutions through examining and addressing the emerging concerns of cybersecurity. The PCDGC partnered with the Philippine Cybercrime Investigation and Coordinating Center and fellow University of the Philippines colleges, the UP College of Law, and the UP Diliman Extension Program in Pampanga for both government and academia to tackle the challenges of cybercrime and cybersecurity in the country together. How do we speak of a cybersecurity governance? How does digital transformation address both national and transnational concerns in cybersecurity? The PCDGC presents the challenges and opportunities in digital security to ensure transparency, accountability, and empowerment are integrated in the cyber policies and operations of practitioners. The online professional courses have brought in new ways of knowledge production and use by bridging both global and national experts and learners, highlighting how human mobility and digital security are both a transnational concern that require global dialogues and concerted action. Convening learner-led activities, group discussions, workshops, exercises, and interactive video lessons engage learners to hone their knowledge and lead key conversations on sustainable development. Organizing capstone projects and class-organized webinars. These are collaborative avenues for learners to integrate both their diverse expertise and new learnings in their line of work and advocacy. These online modes have resulted to mainstreaming migration and digital and cybersecurity challenges in the face of the pandemic through shared experiences for both experts and learners to engage in good practices and potential partnerships, innovative ways of learning to incorporate the learner's voice, and seeking solutions to establish forward-looking learning outcomes to build towards a better tomorrow. The continuing education programs feature around 60 global and national experts, along with dedicated support and engagement from UP Cebu Philippines mentors and teaching assistants. The experts, mentors, and teaching assistants have helped more than 80 learners to connect with one another and aspire together to become future generations of leaders. The online professional courses are open to all practitioners, advocates, and academics interested in a continuing education on sustainable development as a cross-cutting concern in human mobility and digital security. Incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals through education is achievable during the COVID-19 pandemic in capacity building and research through partnerships and innovative learning in webinars, online professional courses, and virtual conferences. UPCPAL Philippines has always been central to promoting dialogues on the cross-cutting concerns in the SDGs among international organizations, national and local authorities, policymakers, academe, advocates, and the public. So no one is left behind.